Everyone, hello. Welcome back to another episode of XTA, something to talk about live. Glad to have you all back. Let's get started. Let's bring up my favorite, Marie Rivetta.
Hello, Jamel. It is so good to see you.
Hello.
And thank you. And welcome everybody to Something to Talk About Live. We are finally in the month of July. So for anyone who needed help, we are officially in the month of July and it is Thursday. I know this because Jamie told me earlier. And today we are going to be discussing a topic that I know makes a lot of people uncomfortable because they don't want to have the conversation because it means doing some self-examination and cleanup, which is about bi erasure and bi invisibility. There's a lot of interesting statistics we could talk about when it comes to people who are bi and the people who make up the bi portion of our community. According to the Pew Center for Research, in 2013, they actually found that people who identify as bi make up the largest portion of the LGBTQ community, at 40% of people, according to their survey, identifying as bisexual, with 36% identifying as gay men, 19% as lesbians, and 5% as transgender. So we're talking about the largest population in the community, and yet the part of the population that probably experiences some of the most significant erasure and bias within the community too. So we're going to talk about this and talk about what needs to happen. And to do that, I have two of my colleagues with me again today. So first, I'd like to bring in Jamie Hinkle, our Learning and Inclusion Manager and my normal partner in crime for the work that we do. But I would also like to introduce for the first time to our show, Patrick Cochran, PFLAG's Executive Assistant to our Executive Director and Special Projects Manager, and really willing participant for our conversation today. So welcome, Patrick.
Thanks.
So the article that we are talking about today is actually from Bustle. And I'm going to just note, it's a couple of years old, but the conversation that it starts is still really relevant and we really do need to have. So the article is in Bustle. It was written by Emma McGowan and it was called Bisexuals Are the Largest Group Within the LGBTQ Community, and It's Time to Stop Doubting Us. If you want to get the article and you'd like to get today's discussion questions, make sure you visit straightforequality.org and just click on that discussion series. So,
Jean Marie, you seem to have frozen for me. I don't know if you have frozen for others. The question has come up, which is, how do you define the term bisexual, and is there another term that resonates more for you? Patrick, as Jean Marie works through some tech issues, do you maybe want to start sharing your thoughts on that?
Yeah, of course. So for me, the term bisexual is, and I should mention that this is just my own definition. I think that the term bisexual varies from person to person, and I should not be speaking for everyone when I say this. But for me, this just means that I am attracted to both men and women on the gender binary. And that's just what it means for me. I know that there are people that use other terms. Some people queer or pansexual, but for me, bisexual fits me, and that's what it means.
Yeah, and I would say that for myself, again, and I know that people define the term bisexual in a lot of different ways, that has always been my understanding of it as well, that it is folks who are attracted to both men and women who sort of fall onto those binaries. Now, I will also say that I am somebody who identifies as straight, and so I don't own the definition of this term. And if I meet somebody who tells me that the way that they define the term bisexual for themselves is something different, I've heard folks that have shared that for them it means something along the lines of, I'm attracted to my own gender and others. I've heard people describe it in a variety of different ways. And as an ally, I think one of my responsibilities is to respect the way that people define that term for themselves. And I would also add that, I think that as we see people owning and sort of putting value and self-identifying with different terms like pansexual or queer, it's exactly the same. You know, the way that you tell me what you tell me about what that word means for you is what I'm going to say, and it's how I'm going to respect what you're sharing with me. And I will admit that for myself personally, I feel like pansexual just like intellectually makes more sense to me, like in my head, but that is just me. That is not everybody. And I've also met folks that, you know, for them, owning and sort of self-identifying with the word bisexual is something that's very political for them. That it's a term that people are more familiar with. It is a term that feels is powerful to them. And so again, it's up to me as an ally to respect however people define those terms for themselves. And Jamel, do you have anything that you'd like to share, knowing that Jean Marie has been bumping into some tech issues?
Yeah, she has some tech. She's trying to log back on now. But in the interim, I think you did hit something on the head. I think amongst my friends who identify as bisexual, the definition or the way that they define their sexuality is very personal to them. So I think at that ground level, like there is some camaraderie around the title bisexual, but when you get into like the meat of like what it means to like exude your sexuality or navigate the world, that's kind of where some of the idiosyncrasies come from. So I think that's a good call out that how folks identify can change, or as you kind of live your life, the way that you dye your eyes or cross your T's might come up differently. I think that's a good call out.
Yeah, and I would sort of add to that I have also found in my personal experience that I know people who, depending on the space they're in, that will change the way that they identify. That, you know, in a group of like-minded folks that they know are going to love and accept them regardless, they might use a word like queer, but in a different space, they might identify as bisexual. And so that is also something that in those spaces, I need to be mindful of that and listen for it and think about why that might be happening.
Mm-hmm.
I want to move on to the second question. We have Jean Marie back, but so I guess, Jean Marie, is there anything else that you'd want to add about sort of how you define the term bisexual before we start talking about some common misconceptions?
Actually, no, just because I completely missed the conversation. Thanks to the horrible internet of the desert.
Totally okay. And so, Jean Marie, do you want to read the next question for folks?
Sure, I would love to. And I'm really disappointed I missed the first part of the conversation. So, in your opinion or experience, what is the most common misconception about people who identify as bisexual?
So I think that there are a few, and this comes from people that are in the LGBT community, you know, within it, from people that are gay, people that come from other parts of the community, and then also from outside the LGBT community as well. We get these misconceptions from both ends here. So I think one common one is that it is this kind of convenient label to put on yourself. And this actually comes up in the article that we shared, that someone approached the man being interviewed and said, you know, well, you can't just be in the queer community when it's convenient for you. And I think that is very hurtful for someone who's bisexual to hear, because it is almost never convenient to identify as bisexual, whether you're in a heterosexual relationship or in a homosexual relationship or what have you. It's almost never convenient. And your identity as a bisexual person does not change based on the gender of the person that you happen to be dating at the time. And I think another one that comes up a lot is that bisexuality is this kind of transition term. So it is, and I think that this kind of hits men and women differently. So for men, a lot of people think that the term bisexual is something that you use when you're not yet comfortable saying that you're gay, which is not true. And then for women, I think people believe that it's this term that you use when you're trying to experiment with your sexuality, and that really you're straight, but that you're trying to throw this label on yourself so that you can experiment more freely, which again, all sorts of issues baked in there, but not accurate. So those are two big ones, I think.
And I think, Patrick, that is like so relevant. I mean, the fact, and I don't know if it came up while I was sort of stranded in the black dark zone of nowhereness in the internet, but I mean, the term lug, like lesbian until graduation, you know, people know that term. You don't even need to be a member of the community to know it. It's kind of a running joke. And I can say, as somebody who I can honestly say this, have had to take my own ally journey as an ally to people who are bi, that was a really big thing to get through because it becomes such a strong theme and you hear it repeated so many times that it kind of becomes part of this consciousness, almost to the point that it's repeated without thought of how incredibly biased and what that is actually saying. And frankly, how it's really anti-science, which kind of breaks my heart.
Yeah, and I know that one of the most common misconceptions for me is along the lines of what Patrick was just talking about. This idea that like you're bi now, gay later. And I am fully aware that this is not a conversation about me, but as a woman who has dated bisexual men who were out to varying degrees, like that statement, bi now, gay later, completely erases and diminishes the relationship that I've had with these people, the romantic relationships that we had, the physical, the emotional relationships, by saying, to me, he was never really attracted to you. And I think that was something in the article specifically. There was a quote from one of the men who was interviewed who said, I had just finished being intimate with a woman and had to convince her for 2 hours that I was physically attracted to her.
Yeah.
Like, it's just something that stands out to me as having such a significant impact that people get into this, like it's just a stepping stone. It's just until you figure it out. And Patrick, I know that one of the things that you said when we were discussing this article before our broadcast was that the default always seems to be that people want to be with a man.
Yes.
And like that brings in a whole other world of gender politics and stereotypes, and like the default is everybody wants to be with a man, and that bothers me as well.
Yeah, it's a very, very patriarchal mindset, right? That you have women who are just trying to, you know, get this experimental energy out before they inevitably settle down with a man, which must be what they want. And then also for men, as soon as there is any kind of experimentation or contact with another man, that ruins them for women somehow, and they then are only ever going to want men ever again. It's very problematic, and it really is quite a reflection on how we view things in this very, very patriarchal lens, even within the LGBT community itself. Because again, this mindset also appears within the LGBT community.
Yeah.
And I think that also probably feeds into, because it becomes sort of this vicious circle that people often in the community complain, well, bi people are not engaged as much, they're not as political, they're not out there as much. And yet we've created an environment in which it is 100% unfriendly to be bi and to be out. And so then we start questioning, well, why aren't you engaged? Well, because every time that you actually say that you're bi, it leads to somebody lecturing you and telling you that you actually are, you know, on your way to one direction or the other. And it really becomes vicious inside of our spaces too. And I think that's particularly insidious for a group that has literally hung its hat on acceptance for everyone. And also looking at science and this real, you know, this sort of pushes up against it. I want to talk about that third question, because I think there's a lot of stuff in the third question. And I would love for people who are part of the chat, and I see that a lot of people are writing in, and we are so happy to see everybody every week. I'd like to talk about what people can do, whether you are a member inside of the LGBTQ space, whether you are one of our allies. What are the kinds of things that we can do to, first of all, stop bi erasure, but also what are some of those things that we should be paying attention to and intervening in? I mean, because we can use our privilege as allies to sometimes engage these. So maybe Patrick and then Jamie, and then we'll all get into the conversation.
So I think there are two things that we can do. And one, I think, very important one that really kind of ties into a lot of other national discussions we're having is that people within the LGBT community really need to stop policing who belongs in these spaces, in these traditionally LGBTQ friendly spaces. If we're talking about, you know, gay bars, for instance, or lesbian bars, if someone is in that space that appears on the surface, and this is very important that it's on the surface, to be in a heterosexual relationship, it is not incumbent upon you to tell that person that they don't belong and that they are invading an LGBTQ space. Because A, that person, both of those people, one or both, could be bisexual, and therefore they belong, because that's the B in LGBTQ. And you're also kind of discounting the experience of trans folks who can be very passing as people that were assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth, whatever the case may be. It really does lead to a lot of problems when people within the community try to police these spaces and try to limit them to people that appear to be in homosexual relationships only, because that excludes all sorts of trans folk, non-binary folk, and bisexual people. It's not just a problem for bisexual people, but it does impact them. The second thing that I think is really important is media representation. I think that bisexual people are very underrepresented, which is true for the LGBT community in general, but they also have this problem where when someone is portrayed in the media who could be bisexual, they're always portrayed as actually being gay. And there are a couple of recent examples of that. One is Brokeback Mountain, where you have Ennis and Jack, who are both in homosexual and heterosexual relationships simultaneously. However, it's always the gay cowboy movie. It's not the bi cowboy movie, it's the gay cowboy movie. And then the second one, which I think was kind of more insidious, is in Bohemian Rhapsody. Freddie Mercury, there is a scene where he tells his female partner, I think I'm bisexual. And she says, no, Freddie, you're gay. Yeah, that's problematic for a whole number of reasons, because it really does play on that trope that men who are bisexual are really just on that stepping stone to being gay, and they just really don't want to admit it. And the way that scene was framed really underpins that, because Freddie Mercury seems so unsure when he says, I'm bisexual, whereas his female partner says, no, you're definitely gay. And what makes that even worse is that the director of that film is gay. This is someone within the LGBT community making that kind of portrayal of someone who was openly bisexual. So I think both of those are very important issues that we need to tackle: media representation and also over-policing of LGBT cases.
And I just want to throw on the media thing. I just have to say, the movie that always gets stuck in my mind is Chasing Amy, which is just get fixed by the right straight man and it's all going to be okay kind of thing. And I think it would be nice if we saw a little bit less of that kind of stuff. Jamie.
Yeah, well, and I think that the media representation is a big thing. Another example that sticks out to me, and is something that we've talked about on Something to Talk About Live, is in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. One of the characters begins to date a woman, and everyone who talks about Tara and Willow's relationship says it's the first lesbian relationship on a teen drama. It's this like monumental thing, and it's, by all accounts, that character, Willow, was bisexual, but because she had a relationship with a woman, the conversation then becomes that she's a lesbian. And I think that it's up to us as allies to call that out when it happens. And Freddie Mercury is another sort of prime example of anytime I hear somebody say, well, Freddie was gay, I'm like, no, by all accounts, he was bisexual and continued to have relationships with men and women until he passed. Like, no. And I think it's my responsibility to sort of call that out as an ally. And one of the other things that I do think that allies can do when we're talking about bi-erasure, when we're talking about the various ways that folks are sort of removed from the conversation, is to straight up just believe people. Whatever they tell you about themselves, just believe them. If somebody tells you that they're pansexual and to your knowledge they've never had a relationship with somebody that is not sort of hetero presenting, believe them anyways. And you do have a friend who identifying as bisexual is in fact a way for them to test the waters to come out as gay or lesbian, that doesn't diminish the experience of anyone who consistently and persistently identifies as bi or pan or queer. Like, believe people at their word and just sort of take their lead. And I think that would hopefully go a long way in sort of the erasure of this huge part of the LGBTQ plus community.
Yeah. And, I feel like inside of our spaces, inside of our LGBT spaces, we need to do a better job. I mentioned in the beginning, I have had my own ally journey on this. I was terrible. I will completely admit it. Going down every possible bad stereotype you could possibly imagine. And for me, I think that, first of all, getting to know more people and hearing their stories and realizing how effective they can be in explaining identities when we give people the space and the validity to actually do that is really, really critical. And I think the part that I keep coming back to is, as a community that has like staked so much of who we are on science and good information, to ignore the existence of people who are bi and pan is just an absolute injustice. Because, I mean, the article references Kinsey's research, and what we are finding is that Kinsey was right all that time ago. And as people are more honest, more people are in the center of that spectrum, not necessarily on the binaries. Very few people, in fact, fewer and fewer people are on the binaries than they ever were. And so I think by having these conversations, by talking about how, again, the phrase I've been using a lot lately is the rising tide lifts all boats, that when it's good for all of us, it's really better for all of us. But we actually need to choose to educate ourselves. We need to actually take responsibility for the stuff that we've gotten wrong. And we actually need to tell our stories of how we got to be better allies, because not always intuitive. And it's also frankly embarrassing. Like, I'm not proud of some of my behavior, but I'm really glad that people gave me the space to learn and to hopefully become a better advocate. And some of that is admitting you got it wrong. And we expect people to do it for us. It's time for us to do it for our bi and pan loved ones and our friends.
Well, and I think that one of the other things that we talked about as a small group is that I think that not to put the burden of stopping bi erasure on people who identify as bisexual, but one of the things that has been helpful over the past 5 or 10 years is people who are bisexual, and I'm thinking specifically of celebrities that are bisexual and are in long-term relationships, saying, might be in a long-term relationship with this person, but I'm still queer. I'm still bisexual. Being in this particular relationship does not change the way that I identify and does not change to whom I am attracted. And I think that the more we see that, and when we are able to create spaces that feel safe for people to do that, that this is going to hopefully be something that we see less and less of.
I think that that's definitely true. And I think that, again, to echo the point that one should not put the onus of getting rid of bi erasure on the bi community itself. And certainly that's not something that I want to do as a bi person. But there is, I think, a tendency sometimes, as a result of feeling like we will be erased or we will be questioned, to kind of hide our identity sometimes. When in my last relationship, which was with a man, if someone said that we were gay, I didn't always correct them, just because it's exhausting to have to do that all the time. Or when I was in a relationship with a woman before that, I didn't always tell people, obviously, that we were both bisexual and that this wasn't this straight people. It is exhausting to have to do it all the time. So I don't do it. I know a lot of people in the bisexual community don't do it all the time. But it is something that I hope that eventually people will get more comfortable with saying that they are bisexual, regardless of what kind of relationship they are or not are not in. And that does come down to, though, again, feeling more comfortable both in and out of traditional LGBTQ spaces.
Yeah. I think so. Jamel, would you like to come back in? I don't know if we had any questions, but I did see that the comments were scrolling along, and I didn't know if you wanted to share any of that with us.
So we mostly had folks that were chiming in as you all were conversing. No one posed any direct questions, but I did see that a lot of the comments, there were two primary things that kind of sprouted up. And you touched on this a little bit, Patrick, but one of them is the politics of space. And this is something that we talked about last week and the last couple of weeks about wanting to create space for a variety of people and affinity groups. And identities. So as it pertains to this particular discussion, what are some things that we can do to make, bi folks more comfortable in traditional and non-traditional spaces, aside from hearing their stories and allowing for them to exist?
Any other suggestions?
I don't know. I think there are so many, just like, I guess, expand your expectations of who you think you'll see in these spaces. I think if you go into it thinking, I might see people that appear as though they are in a heterosexual relationship, then people won't be so confused by it, and they won't be as prone to maybe look at these people as outsiders or anything else, people that don't belong there. I think managing those expectations and really teaching yourself, hey, looks aren't everything in terms of relationships and in terms of people in the LGBTQ community. So hopefully, if people kind of go into this with the expectation that I'm not going to see traditional heterosexual relationships, if they get rid of that expectation, that might help.
Can I raise one thing that I saw come up in the comments a couple of times? There were a few people, someone mentioned really bringing people awareness around authors who are bisexual, so you can actually read their stories and read their work, and please pay for their work when you do that. Yes, thank you so much for putting that up, Jamel. I also saw somebody else talking about correctly attributing the identities of bi people when you were talking about LGBTQ history, that we are making those corrections. Like, I know that when we teach our history class and we start with Sappho, one of the first things we say is she was not a lesbian, she was bisexual. And that was our first example of bi erasure that we can talk about. Somebody just mentioned Visibility Day is on September 23rd. So there's an opportunity, not Invisibility Day. Sorry. Sorry. What else? Oh, Jamie.
I was going to add, when we're thinking about sort of creating these spaces that feel comfortable and feel safe, that Jean Marie, one of the things that we often talk about is like, don't make assumptions. And I think that is a lot of what Patrick was just saying. But we also talk about the importance and the significance of symbols and visibility. And so, like, there is more than a rainbow flag. There is more than a rainbow flag with black and brown stripes. And so when you're thinking about that imagery that you're creating and those visible symbols of inclusion, like, expand your horizons a little bit. There is so much out there. There are great resources that can help you learn more about the flags that represent various communities. And that's just one example that I think is really sort of easily visual to people. But think about how you are creating that space.
Mm-hmm. This kind of reminds me of a lecture that I took my freshman year of college so long ago. But my professor was talking about the follies of community. And I feel like we've kind of touched on one. So, like, I think we frequently have this imagery of what it means to be the gay community and the symbols that you see and the, usual suspects that you'll see, in gay spaces. And, like, that's cool and all, but also, like, there's always going to be people that may not choose to appear in that way, or they may choose to associate differently. And I think that's exactly what all of you were saying. Like, sometimes you have to leave some of those stereotypes, some of those usual suspects out of the picture to make way for, other folks to come as they are and show us, how they choose to be and show up as community. So I think that's a good call out.
I think we probably have time for maybe one more comment now, and then we have to do some wrap up.
Yeah, I think Diego posed a really good question. He says, in the HIV community, we have a word discordant for partners that are positive or negative. It would be serodiscordant, would be what it would be called. But he's asking, how do you navigate when one person is bi and the other person is not?
That is a very good question. And I can't answer from personal experience, actually, because when I was out, since I've been out, I should say, I've only dated people that are also bisexual, which is kind of weird that worked out that way. But I don't really have a good answer, I don't think, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, and I will say, as a straight woman who has dated bisexual men that are out to varying degrees, that was a question I got a lot of, like, aren't you nervous or like more nervous than you would be otherwise? So I think it's a really, really complicated question and one we definitely don't have time for in the next like 30 seconds.
We can do an entire show just on that.
Yeah.
This is just the beginning of the conversation. And I'm hoping, and our hope with this every single week is that this little conversation is going to lead to more conversations. So I want to thank Jamie and thank Patrick and thank Jamel for running the entire show for us. We are always so glad to have everybody here. We will definitely be back again with you next week. So as we wrap up today, I want to thank you for spending time with us. We love our 30 minutes with everybody every week. We always remind people as our wishes for the week are to run fast, laugh hard, and be kind. And since we are going into a holiday weekend, we would love if everybody has a very safe weekend and wear your mask because science actually matters. Have a good week. We will see you next week at Something to Talk About. Make sure you visit us at pflag.org. I'm Jean Marie Nevada. Have a great weekend. Bye, everybody.